would have remembered here in a little bit, Aaron.
I don't think you're better at it, Caleb. It is kind of dry.
Yeah, moisture. We got 4,500 hundredths of rain, so that was good. We could use a little bit more.
That's a term for.
A little over 4/10.
Almost half an inch.
My digital gauge does 100ths.
Let's just do halves and quarters.
Half. So it's just right under a half inch. My rain gauge dumps out at every 100th. So it counts them. Small, minute amounts. All right, well, we are in Acts chapter 2. Last Sunday, we got down to about verse 21, 22. And so we looked at this prophecy from Joel, and that's what we finished up last week. We noticed some significant things about the prophecy of Joel. What does this prophecy relate to? What was the connection here? First off, what was the prophecy written in? What type of language? That would be verse 17 through 21. Yeah, apocalyptic. And so there is some apocalyptic language there. It's very figurative. And so when Joel wrote about it, he was talking about the future. That future is here. And so the importance of Joel's prophecy is the connection that Peter was making with Christ and with this day. Joel chapter 2 is definitely a chapter that reflects, or it speaks about this day happening. And so we saw some of the language that was used there, and that language is apocalyptic, and it's talking about the end of something. It's the end of the law. It's the end of the old law, and the ushering of the new coming in now. And so we have, this language that's used. It's used in the end of something, a destruction of something. That's talking about, in verse 20, the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood. That doesn't always refer to, many times, honestly, it does not refer to Judgment Day. It always refers to an end of something, like a nation, and we looked at that last week. And so Joel, what Peter is doing here is he's connecting a prophecy that they understood and knew to this day. It's kind of a slap in the face because they should have been recognizing that prophecy and what was going on in the world, and specifically in what is going on with the apostles at this point. But this is not the only prophecy that Peter will refer to, and so we're going to see, that's what we're heading into next, is another prophecy. But we get down to verse 22. And it says, "Men of Israel, hear the words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know." And so Peter he's really starting into his sermon here and connecting, because really 14 through 21 was answering what was happening that day. It was answering the apostles being able to speak in tongues and the Spirit coming out, pouring out upon man. And then in verse 22, he turns it to what he's speaking about, and that's Christ. And he says, Jesus of Nazareth. Why would he say Jesus Christ of Nazareth?
Jesus' name was a Hebrew name that wasn't commonly used.
Okay,
So
yeah.
where he was from was like these last days today.
Exactly. It would have been something that they needed to designate who he was talking about. And as we're going to see, it's important that he uses this and gives them the name that they need to know, because he's going to connect Jesus Christ of Nazareth to the Messiah. He's going to connect those two together. Not only that, what was just, as we just talked about, what was Nazareth considered? Where was it at in the world? It was in Galilee. What had they just been mocked for by some people? Being men that were from Galilee, that were uncultured, didn't understand other people's or care about other people's cultures, languages, things like that. And so they just got done answering that, and then he says, now, this Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who, earlier, others in John chapter 1, and Nathaniel, what did Nathaniel say? How can anything good come out of Nazareth? And so I just think it's interesting how he connects that there and saying, hey, this man of Nazareth that you mocked earlier about us, he is the Messiah. And so he says, hear these words. I think that's important because remember we talked about last week the connection between hearing the gospel. We can see the steps of salvation in this sermon. It wasn't, feel this or things like that, but it was hear these words. He's preaching a sermon. They're going to build their faith upon the message that Peter gives them. The Holy Spirit is working through Peter to show them. And they're going to build their faith, that faith in Christ, from that. And so it says, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs. And so he was approved by God. The New King James uses the word attested. Does King James use that same word? It may be approved there. But attested is defined as to declare, to show, to prove what kind of person anyone is, to prove by arguments. And I really like this. Thayer states demonstrate. How did Christ demonstrate who he was? Okay. His knowledge, his teaching. I didn't think about that one, but you're right. His teaching, his knowledge. What else?
Miracles, wonders, and signs.
Yeah, his miracles, wonders, and signs too. People were amazed by what he knew, right? And I think that's important too because the amount of knowledge that Christ had. But here he's laying down an argument really in what he is showing about Christ. So first he states that Christ is approved by God. He was approved, he was attested, he demonstrate his life. And you notice that these were things that were done by God through Christ. So the power of God was shown through Christ, which proved he was the Son. Somebody read Matthew 3 and verse 17. Okay, so that's God speaking, the Father speaking about the Son, Christ, and saying that he is pleased in Christ. So God was working things through Christ to prove that he was his Son. And so he did miracles. Miracles are powerful deeds that demonstrate the power of God. Wonders, the word really means to, excite wonders and wonder in what people see. And signs. Signs are important because they're evidence. It's evidence. The things that he did, the miracles he did, was evidence for who he was. You think about it. Think about the prophets. I think I'm going to talk about this later. I'm going to bring it up now. You think about the prophets before Christ. You think about Moses. Was Moses able to do all the things that Christ did? He did some amazing things, didn't he? God worked through Moses to part the Red Sea.
The most important thing, he wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
That's one of Christ's most important things that he did. Was be perfect. It's hard to think, the things he went through, we
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really big difference between the two. Yeah, you look at the life of Moses, and that's the comparison. You have the old law, which is centered around Moses. Moses brought in the new old law. Then you have Christ who brought in the new. And that's really the book of Hebrews, speaking about how the new is better. It is brought in. It is mediated by Christ, which is perfect. Talked about that in Hebrews chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 3, about him being perfect. But you look at the things that Moses was able to do, there were wonders. You think about all the plagues that was brought about in Egypt. God did them through Moses. That was wonderful. That was, those were miracles. But no one was able to do the things that Christ did. He was the first. He was different than the prophets before him. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus asked Peter, "Who do men say that I am?" What was some of the things they said? Yeah, Elijah. Elijah did a lot of amazing things, right? Who else? Yeah, John the Baptist. Maybe he was a prophet. And then Peter said, and he asked Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" He says, "You are the Son of God." He could see by the things that Christ did, by the things that he taught, he was different. He wasn't Elijah. He wasn't Moses. He wasn't a prophet. He was more than that. And so what Peter is trying to lay a foundation for here is that they should have recognized Christ as somebody different. They should not have just seen him as a prophet or as a man that was, as the Pharisees, they just wanted to believe he was just somebody that was trying to pretend to be God. They should have recognized that he was the Son of God. And then if they had recognized that, what would they have done? What would they connect the dots to? What they were looking for. Each one of them were looking for the Messiah. That was, every prophet speaks about this coming time of when Israel will be great again, not in physical, but the fact that Christ came and was living and brought about the church. And you go through all the minor prophets, the major prophets, they all speak about this time coming. They should have known that. And that's what he's trying to get them to see. He was different. You should have known that. And so his characteristics, somebody read John 14 and verse 9.
Jesus said to him, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father, so how can you say, 'Show us the Father'?"
That's an amazing statement because, Thomas is wondering, he's saying, "Show us God." Or Philip, is it Philip? Philip is saying, "Show us the Father." And he's saying, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. His characteristics, it's, Justin brought up, what was one of the major differences between him and Moses? He was perfect. His characteristics showed that he was not like us. He was perfect. He was God. And they should have recognized that. They saw him. They saw his miracles. They saw his wonders. They saw his signs. They saw his characteristics. They heard his teachings. Yet why did they not recognize him as the Messiah? It's easy for us to sit here and go, well, they're stupid. How could they not see that? If I was in their position, I would have not recognized it, would we? That's a tough question.
What was their vision of the Messiah? Do you know that?
Well, what they wanted was, like the grand entrance into Jerusalem. They laid down the palm leaves. They looked for a king. They looked for somebody that was going to, take over, destroy the Roman Empire, and bring the glory to Israel to where, make a grand entrance, be that king that they wanted, like David. They wanted another David, on earth, all physical. They were not looking for a spiritual kingdom. They were not looking for a spiritual king. And so when Christ was not what they wanted or expected, they just ignored him. And that brings us to the last point, or the last part of that verse. He said, I'm going to read it again. Men of Israel, hear the words Jesus of Nazareth, verse 22. A man attested by God, so he's proved to you he by miracles, wonders, signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Think about that statement. What is Peter saying? You yourselves also know.
That they were there, they saw it, heard it.
They know it. They saw it. They heard it. They were there. They just ignored it. They knew who Jesus was, but they didn't want to believe it. It would be hard to, to say this now. It'd be easy for us to say, well, it would be hard to stand there and watch somebody's hand be completely healed. A man that we've seen all of our life get up and start to walk, that had been lame his whole life. To see someone who had been blind his whole life start to see. And not go, wow, that's something different about that person. And some people did. You have 120 that were in the upper room in Acts chapter 1 who were disciples of Christ. And so there was some that did. But he was saying here, think about this. You knew who Jesus was, but you didn't want to believe it. They ignored the truth to believe what they wanted to believe. Does that happen today? Sometimes we do that, right? Sometimes we may ignore what's the truth to believe what we want to believe. Unfortunately, many in the world, that's what they're doing. We have the truth right here. We can get the answers. We have everything we need right here. And it just amazes me, you hear people that quote passages or talk about the Bible, and they just completely skip over what's truth and just find what they want to make them feel better. And so, it's easy for us to sit back and go, wow, if I was in their position, I would have done differently. But we still do it today sometimes. People still do it today. Ignore what's truth. And so he's really, I would say, in a sense, slapping them in the face. He's stepping on their toes. He's saying, this man, he's connected the person they know to the wonders that he did, that God did through him, which showed to them he was the Son, and saying, you should have recognized it, but you didn't. And you decided to do something different. And so verse 23, it says, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death. So you took that man who proved to you who he was, you crucified him and you killed him. You put him to death. And so, you think about what's going through their minds. Okay, I messed up. I should have recognized he was God. He was the Son of Man. He was the Messiah. And I was the one yelling. Possibly they could have been there saying, crucify him, crucify him. They wanted him dead. And he's connecting the dots. And so it says, verse 23 again, him being delivered by a determined purpose. I like how the New King James uses this word, purpose. The King James says what? Counsel. And a lot of times when we think of a council, we think of the Sanhedrin, or the group that tried to get Christ crucified. They had already determined what they were going to do. That's not what it's talking about here. This word counsel means purpose. And so what it's saying is him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. What that means is that God had a plan. In the ESV, it says a definite plan, doesn't it? I like that. A definite plan and foreknowledge of God. What does that mean by foreknowledge? What does that word foreknowledge mean? Yeah, know something ahead of time. Whose foreknowledge is talked about here? Deities, gods. So they didn't recognize Christ as who he was. They crucified him, but yet God knew it was going to happen. God had a plan. This was all part of his plan. God had a plan, and that plan was executed exactly the way God knew it would happen. Somebody read John 3 and verse 16. I skipped over another verse. We'll go back there in a second. John 3:16.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life.
You know, this is one of those verses that most people in the world know, and for a reason of talking about God's love. But if you really think about that verse, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. It didn't say, for God so loved the world that he let them, not that, I would say, he gave him. He had a plan. God, that has the idea of having a plan. God knew it was going to happen, and he let that happen. Go back to Luke 22 and verse 22. It's a verse I skipped over.
Saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me, nevertheless not my will, but thine be done.
Christ knew what the plan was, right? Christ knew that he had to go to the cross. Christ knew this was a part of what needed to happen. There had to be, and we could get into that subject, but there had to be that perfect sacrifice. You know, that's Hebrews. The book of Hebrews talks about, chapter 9, chapter 10, about the fact that the blood of bulls and goats was not enough. Needed that perfect sacrifice, and that was Christ. And so Christ knew what needed to happen. And not only that, somebody read 1 Peter 1, 17 through 21.
And if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct, revered by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God.
Okay, so Peter talks about how Christ's sacrifice, his shedding of the blood, is that redemptive purpose, is redeeming what he was going to do to redeem us, was planned, was foreordained before the foundation of the world. That means God and the Godhead had already decided what was going to happen, already knew what was going to happen. Now that's hard for us to grasp, knowing because you think about it, you and I are free moral agents. We can make our choices. We can do whatever we choose to do. We can serve God. We don't have to serve God. God's not going to force us. But yet God can know what we're going to do. That's hard for us to fathom. But that's his infinite knowledge that he has. And so you think about that here and what Peter is saying. He's saying, you did not recognize who Christ was. You chose to crucify him. You chose to kill him. But you know what? God knew you were going to do it. God had it planned before the world began. You just basically helped God's plan happen. It needed to happen. And so you think about being in their position and going, oh, wow, we messed up, we sinned, yet God knew we were going to do it. But it's the same for you and I, right? Does God know that you and I are going to sin? Why did he send Christ? Why did he redeem him, or why did he redeem us? He knew we were going to do it. So not only was he thinking about, you put it in today, you're thinking about today, not only he knew that they were going to do what they did, but God knew you were going to do what you did, and I was going to do what I did. And I was going to need Christ. And that's because of his foreknowledge. And so we have that redemption through Christ. And so the last part of that verse, Christ was taken by lawless hands, crucified and put to death. They had free will, but God knew they would do it. Knox commentary that I have is really good. He stated this, quote, "When one considers the law under which they lived, the Mosaic law, it is easy to see how they transgressed the law. They had been given every indicator which would allow them to discern who the Messiah was when he came. They refused to acknowledge him. The very trial they gave Jesus was in violation of their law in many ways, a few of which, number one, they were not to have a trial at night. Number two, it could not be a unanimous verdict. Number three, they paid for false witnesses to testify against him, and the list goes on. They were indeed violators of the law of God, the law that God gave them. They were lawless." And so when it says here that Christ was taken by lawless hands, the actions that they did were against the law. They had sinned. Okay, go ahead.
I thought the lawless hands would be the Romans, because the Jews couldn't legally put them to death, right?
So they used the Romans to do what they wanted done. Because they knew if the Romans took Christ, they could kill him. It is the Jews. I think it could include both. Some think it's just the Romans. I think it includes both because the Jews plotted. They did all of the plotting. The paying off the false witnesses, the getting him arrested in the middle of the night, the trials that was done in the middle of the night. That was all their plot. They just used the Romans to fulfill what they wanted. Because they knew if they got the Romans to do it, he would die. And so the lawless really is, I think, focused on that. And I think it could include the Romans too.
It could, but they never would have crucified Jesus had the Jews not been like, here,
No.
take care of this for us.
I mean, what did Pilate do?
He tried to get them to not.
I mean, none of the Roman leaders wanted to do it.
No, they knew it was wrong. And I think that the Jews crucifying Jesus themselves knew it was a bridge too far. They're like, we'll do all this other stuff behind the scenes, but we can't physically kill him.
Yeah.
So
Same thing as the elders and Pharisees that paid Judas to betray him. When they got the money back, they're like, well, we can't use this money for the treasury. Well, they used it to pay off someone to betray Jesus. And so it was lawless what they had done. It was against the law. They had sinned. They had done several things against the law. And so the word there, lawless hands, truly shows their actions.
So what's today's Jews believe as far as Jesus? I mean, would they believe?
I don't think they believed that he was who he was.
You don't believe that the man was 18. Believe, you're saying or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So today's Jews, are they believing in Jesus, or just believing he's a prophet, or what?
I think they just believed he was a prophet. Believed he was a good person or something like that.
There's two types of Jews. Those who believe that Christ has come, and those who believe that he hasn't.
Yeah. It's there's still a group that rejects that he was Christ. So
The Messianic and the other type.
I don't know the different types. Orthodox Jews, I don't know. That's different.
I can't remember if the Messianic believed that he was the Messiah or they're looking for the Messiah, but there's two main groups in Israel today.
Yeah. So yeah, they just don't want to believe. You know, like Islam recognizes Christ, but they state he was just a great prophet too. So it comes out of that same doctrine, the same thought there too. And so they were lawless in what they did. Now it brings into the thought, because you think about this, they had free will. They chose to not recognize Christ as the Messiah. They killed him, but yet it was still part of God's plan. Okay, so God used their wicked hands to fulfill his plan. This is not the first time that's happened. You think about under the old law, in the Old Testament, how many times did God use wicked nations to fulfill his purpose? Here's some examples. Somebody read Isaiah 13, 1, verse 1, and then also read verse 17 through 19. So verse 1 tells us who it's about, and then verse 17 and through 19.
The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son
you I will destroy kingdoms. With you I will break in pieces the horse and its rider. With you I will break in pieces the chariot and its rider. With you also I will break in pieces man and woman. With you I will break in pieces old and young. With you I will break in pieces the young man and the maiden. With you also I will break in pieces the shepherd and his flock. With you I will break in pieces the farmer and his yoke of oxen. And with you I will break in pieces governors and rulers. And I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all the evil they have done in Zion in your sight, says the Lord.
Okay, some think this is a reference back to the first part of that, to Babylon being God's hammer. But in the context, it really is focused on destruction of Babylon. But what we're trying to point out here is the fact that God used, wicked and rebellious hearts to fulfill His plans. And so when we get to Acts chapter 2, they were rebellious, they were wicked, but yet God still fulfilled His purpose through them. Nothing, and what I really think that points to is the fact that nothing that a man can do can stop God's plan. Nothing. You think about all the years of the Jews, all the times that they were wicked, they were evil, God punished them, they'd come back, all the nations that oppressed them, God still brought about Christ with a pure lineage to David and all the way back to Abraham. And so, in a way, He's telling them, God knew they were going to do this, and there was nothing they could do to stop God's plan from happening. And God used their wickedness and their rebellion to fulfill His plan. And so, it shows today also to us that nobody in this world can stop God. Not even that, the devil can't stop God. A lot of people say that this is fight against the devil and God. What is the devil? We've talked about this. Who is he? What he used to be? An angel. Did God create angels? God created the devil. I mean, he was an angel. He made the choice that he did. We've looked at that on Sunday nights. God cannot even be stopped by the angels. His plan is going to be fulfilled no matter what. And so here He's showing them that God continued to fulfill His plan through them. And that brings us to the next verse. He says, you didn't recognize Him. You then killed Him, crucified Him, put Him to death. But verse 24, whom, this is Christ, God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that He should be held by it. And so though you chose to crucify Him, God used that as an opportunity to show that He can lose the pains of death. And that His resurrection, and really His resurrection is what's important. Peter is showing that God's plan was completed in the raising of Christ. Imagine the shock of the people to hear God knew before they did it that they were going to crucify Him. And then the fact that God was going to use that to prove of who He was. You think about some of these prophecies. This kind of goes back a little bit. I kind of skipped over this. Somebody read Genesis 3 and verse 15. We're about out of time. We'll finish on this. Genesis 3 and verse 15. Sometimes I get off my notes. Sorry. Genesis 3 and verse 15.
And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
Okay, so this is a prophecy of Christ and what was going to happen. And then Isaiah 53, 6 through 12. We'll close on this. Isaiah 53, 6 through 12.
All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment.
Go through verse 12, if you'd like,
Oh,
please.
okay. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors.
You know, we sit here and go, wow, they would have been shocked to recognize that God knew what they were going to do. Yeah, they could go back to Isaiah 53 and read this and go, yeah, we did that. God knew. He, through the Spirit, had Isaiah write about this, what we were going to do and what we did. They could have read it and seen it. So it's just interesting. So next week what we'll do is we'll start back here and we'll look at the importance of the resurrection, and then we will move on into a prophecy about Christ. Any questions or comments about this? All right, thank you guys for your time.